Welcome to Biota.org Interviews. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Nell Tenhaaf, who's an associate professor in the art department at York University, Toronto. Nell, for people not familiar with your background, can you please give some discussion into how you got interested in artificial life art?
Well, I've been working with electronic media for a good length of time, a couple of decades, I guess. And I have to say that when I first started looking at artificial life in the early 90s, I was a true skeptic. I was very immersed in, the very theoretical take on art at the time, and I was a critic of science, and I laugh because it seems kind of silly now in retrospect. And that was my view on artificial life as well. I looked a little bit, I have to admit, down my nose at these kind of critters that people were building. But from that first intro into it, as with many things that are intrinsically interesting, I started to find out more and more about it, and gradually it started to show up in my own electronic work. First, really just as a kind of reference in imaging, and then more and more as a way of building. So, building interactive works, building kind of agent-like works, that sort of thing.
So I guess you've touched on this a little bit in that description, but there's a contemporary problem with regards to the definition, the internal definition of artificial life for artificial life developers, and I'm assuming also artificial life artists. Do you have some insight into what makes artificial life art?
Well, it's interesting. In the VIDA competition, we, meaning a kind of, loose evolving collective, because although there were some core people in the competition, and we can go into that in a minute, but really it's a kind of evolving, jury of artists and peers who are looking at this stuff, and we've had various kinds of arguments, around resistances of one kind or another, and one of those resistances, for example, has been against, certainly against having it be too broad. So in other words, it's not a sort of really broad subset of electronic media art. It has to have a direct reference to the research. We've tried to track the research. But we have, for example, a resistance to wet art, and I have been among those with that resistance because the research wasn't doing wet art, or it didn't seem to link. So it has been a really kind of a very intricate push and pull as to how we, closely enough can know what's going on in A-Life research itself without being researchers. And then, how, art isn't research, and so you have to have, sort of more openness and more flexibility as to what artists are doing. I would say, as a kind of summary, well, for one thing that, we've evolved, as I say, and so, we become more open to formats just because they get more and more interesting, wet art being a prime example. And at the same time, we theorize, right? So, as I have been writing about VIDA over the last, it's actually not 10 years, it's 9 years, because of this little shtick of having started at VIDA 2.0, but we're treating it as a 10th year anniversary nonetheless. We theorize, and so writing this article, I've thought through quite clearly, what does embodiment mean? A key concept, what does embodiment mean that's the same in both A-Life research and in A-Life art? So, building robots would be a really good example of that. But then how is embodiment different, because it's art? How is it more open, and how does it encompass, more kinds of forms and more kinds of significations because it's art? How is the general public, present in A-Life research sort of in comparison with art? So there's just a lot of ways, in which one can think about those sameness and differences, and it has a lot to do with being able to go to the A-Life conferences, and because that's usually the best way, of both plugging into what's happening in the research and connecting up with people who themselves are bridgers, who are interested in making the connections rather than isolating what their practice is.
Is what you're saying that artificial life artists should be very acutely aware of the current state of the art in terms of research? Or would it be possible for an artificial life artist to come to it without any background knowledge and just create something that was intrinsically artificial life art?
That's a very good way of posing the question. I think there has to be some awareness, and I think that really varies. And so, with something like the VIDA competition, I think has a really important role in making in describing the parameters, and then those aren't all the parameters. Of course, there's always, you're always looking for something in a way that exceeds your parameters. But I think we play a very important role in that, and I think that's community. That's how you sort of indicate to people what they might look at. In a way, I think that going back to the wet artist again, you can tell this is my current fascination, one of them anyway. But going back to the wet artist, I don't think that they really saw their work. Let's take Biota as kind of prime example. I don't think they really saw their work as artificial life at all. I think they saw it much more as biology or biotechnology. But I think that if I, for example, am at the European Conference on Artificial Life just recently in Lisbon and see that, they have a day-long session on the relationship between A-life and biology, which is something that I don't think that they've really carried on through the years. I think they kind of leave it and return to it, but there's a big return to it right now, and that's because of technologies of artificial cell design, and also for theoretical, pretty complicated theoretical reasons. And so I think that then, yes, the tissue artists, we now, there's now the connection can be made there, because in the research world, things have changed, developments have happened. So I suppose there can be there can be a move toward, or there can be gestures towards what we could call life art that aren't necessarily thought of through a prism of the research world, but then, the research changes. So, it's a lovely kind of always shifting, changing thing.
We'll return to this in just a few minutes, but you have mentioned VIDA, and I know it's 9 years on. You've written recently about the history and the progression of VIDA. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Just want to mention some of the numbers because they're pretty good. It's, 25 prize-winning works, 56 honorary mentions. That's since the first competition in 1999. And also, big international scope, and that continues to build. So far the count is 23 countries. There was the introduction of an incentive award for new production for artists in Ibero-American countries, Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, and that started in 2001. And, I don't know how many, I think 15 of those have been given out so far. So, there's been a real push, the foundation here, I must do my plug, because they really are behind this, the Telefonica Foundation, and they have their outfits in most of the Latin American countries, and they really promote it everywhere. So that's been a huge thrust, to have more people working with these kinds of technologies and ideas, in those countries. But other than that as well, and we get really interesting, some Armenian artists now inquiring about submissions. I don't mean to, highlight people that I think are more fringe than others, but a real spread around the globe. Let's see, what else can I say about that that's most pertinent? I did kind of in the catalog text that I've written, and also that's to be published in Leonardo for the 10th anniversary, I did kind of categorize, and it felt pretty good about that, the way I was, able to encompass, I guess, the works into this sort of range of, but looking at it not necessarily through strict, A-Life research categories, but also concepts like the ready-made, because research itself becomes a sort of ready-made in art, A-Life research in A-Life art. And then also the products, the sort of applications of A-Life research are taken up by artists, and they're hacked and fooled around with, and that sort of calls attention to commodity fetishism with this perspective of gadgets that are alive. So I liked my categories, but of course, as soon as I started to make these descriptions, I began to see what I was leaving out. So again, there's the kind of, there's always a push forward.
Now, this idea of the ready-made is fascinating because I'm interested in whether artificial life art can go back into artificial life research.
Ah, yes. So am I. So am I interested in that, and I'm glad you've posed that, because I do think that it already is, a fairly interesting two-way street, and I think that's going to become more so. There are things now, like perhaps this is a bit of a mundane example, but there's a video competition in the big AAAI, the big North American Artificial Intelligence conference. The first video competition happened at the Vancouver conference, I think, in the last winter sometime, and that's interesting. It's still a bit of a sideshow, but it isn't really, because the way representations are made in that domain, in A-Life and AI research domain, is becoming more and more important, and it isn't just that it's perceived as more and more important. So there's that, and there's also, I think, this really interesting notion that there's a kind of evaluation of concepts, research concepts that can happen in artwork, because artwork has a public. And so even if you don't do literal evaluation, although some of us, like myself and my research collaborator, are interested in literally evaluating, but there's a way that you have access to this kind of feedback, response from a broad public when you have an artwork. So yeah, I think that there is a really quite fascinating two-way flow that I predict will become more so.
Certainly the feedback and discussion through these Biota interviews has been that the aesthetic, even for traditional artificial life developers, if such a thing exists, is really critical. I realised, having asked you this, that I haven't asked you to give a definition of ready-made for folks not familiar with this term.
Well, the word was coined by Marcel Duchamp. Sometimes people confuse it with the surrealist notion of the objet trouvé, which is the idea that any object can be made to be aesthetic. Duchamp's idea is in a certain way the opposite. The urinal, his famous urinal that he signed, Armut, is a great example, because it isn't that is made more aesthetic, it's that the whole industrial and social context of that object is kind of transferred into the gallery and butts up against, a more traditional aesthetic concept in the gallery, at least at that time.
Now, you also have a wonderful position as an educator to see the future of artificial life art being created currently. Can you give any kind of prediction of what the future of artificial life art will look like in the next, say, 9 years?
Yeah, I do think it requires. I think more and more we see these programs, that allow students to indulge, I suppose, their interests in art and science, or art and computation. And so I think that out of those kinds of programs, not when they're sort of forced, but when they grow up quite organically, I think you see a kind of student who, I guess all I can predict is that there'll be a sort of even greater integration into the two milieux. I'm not exactly sure how that will play out, because I think there will always be, galleries that are that kind of space. I don't know. I think perhaps around this idea of testing and testability, that maybe we'll see, more research outcome, from exhibitions, like real, legitimate, valuable research outcome, that will be integrated into what researchers are doing. I really think, I don't have that much to say about the forms. That's really hard to predict, what kind of form it will take. Probably just more and more complex and intricate as computing goes that way, and also as wet work goes that way. I guess if the A-Life research world is doing synthetic cell development, that we're going to see, artists pushing into that further. That's what I imagine.
What I find fascinating looking at a number of contemporary artificial life artists is that they use artificial life as a tool almost with regards to adding additional elements. Some of the most striking ones have included things like anime and various other things which I wouldn't necessarily think of with regards to artificial life art. In terms of this kind of blending, what is your thinking on that?
I think that one thing that the whole zone really lends itself to is a kind of really multiple and immersive, that's not new, immersive experience, but, because it often involves the sense of a world, like an animated world or an adaptive or, shifting, evolving world, I think that quite possibly, it can really push towards, it can push well towards the inclusion of a lot of different, towards the overload that kind of meets us in our culture anyway. But, an overload that the participant or the interactant can manipulate and really, really be an agent within. So, I think it lends itself to this kind of, many elements, but with a intelligent way of being able to sort and organize and be part of, the arrangement of those elements.
Now, you've touched a bit on artificial life academia, you've touched a bit on industry, you've obviously talked a little bit about artificial life art as well, but in terms of the broader artificial life community, what more would you like to see?
Yeah, I think that I would really like there to be some way to deal with the specialization, because there's more and more and more and more knowledge all the time, and there's a kind of splintering. I guess this is in a way that related to my just previous comment, because there's a kind of splintering into many, many specialized zones. And so, I don't know, I guess the web would be good, some kind of databasing, again, sorting method, because it really is hard to follow. It really is hard to even figure out, what your particular track of interest might be, So, I guess just through all these conferences and I can imagine a young person just starting out in this and trying to think, well, what's my entry here? So, but I in the end, I think that's a people network. I think that's, any individual's way of kind of, of making their contacts. And so, for example, it might come down to, a massive university like mine, 45,000 students, having ways for the students in the different departments, to gain the specialized knowledge, to find an entry point. So that's something that still kind of baffles me, and I don't have a clear picture of a solution to that.
Does VIDA itself have any information or any resources that someone entering artificial life art could draw upon?
Well, we have a bibliography. We've got a bibliography that kind of covers which probably needs updating again. That kind of covers some good basic readings. Mitchell Whitelaw, the Australian writer, did an overview of A-Life art, but I think about 3-4 years ago. So ways to read and or Stephen Wilson's constant what's the word, keeping up, I guess, with his compendium of artists, but in all of the electronic media, not just in A-Life. So there are pointers to ways to read about where the intersection has already happened, between A-Life and art. But I guess we could try to develop some tools, now that I think about it, that could point people to some of the main conferences and how they could get interested in the more literally technical aspects of the whole thing. We could do that.
And increasingly the conferences are more and more open after the fact as well, in terms of publication.
Yeah, with posting their stuff, that's right.
So those resources are available.
Yeah, so much is online. Yeah, that's true.
So Nell, any final thoughts for the interview?
It's just that we're excited about this big event. We have some add-ons. There's after the jurying in Madrid in early November this year, there's going to be a gala presentation of the awards in Barcelona at the end of the month, and but there will be in late winter, I think, a conference of some kind, panel discussions. There'll be a way that we gather people around to discuss exactly these kinds of topics that you've brought up. So it's a big year.
Is VIDA still open for entries?
Oh, yes, until October 22nd, and quite frankly, just between you and me, we almost always extend the deadline. But the official deadline date right now is the 22nd of October. And I do want to say that we had some discussion. One of the other things that we haven't had that I think has become interesting is music entries. And when I was in Lisbon, there was an A-Life music concert, which I didn't hear about until just too late, but I got the names of all of those artists, and it's quite a list of a dozen or so that they had. So, yeah, we're really, really open to music submissions. They don't require video, they just require a description of the concept.
And is that open for this year as well?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much, Nell, for the opportunity to interview you on Biota.org.
Well, thank you.